She can't do that, Jamal whispered, sliding half his sandwich toward Marcus. My mom says teachers aren't allowed to take food as punishment. What would you do if your child came home hungry day after day? When Dr. Johnson discovered his son was being starved by a prejudiced teacher who took his lunch every day as punishment, he didn't just get angry, he got even. But what exactly did this brilliant neurosurgeon put in that special lunch bag? And why did it leave the teacher blue-faced and terrified when the police arrived? This shocking true story of injustice, courage, and a father's ingenious plan will leave you stunned. Don't miss a single moment of this incredible journey to justice. Dear viewer, if you are watching my story for the first time, I humbly request you write the location from where you are watching right now, subscribe this channel and press the bell icon now not to miss the notifications of my daily published news stories. Thank you, and let's dive into the full story. Marcus Johnson stood outside room 203, clutching his backpack straps tightly. At 12 years old, being the new kid at Westfield Academy mid-semester was intimidating enough, but the reputation of Ms. Peterson, his new homeroom teacher, made his stomach twist into knots. You must be Marcus, a sharp voice cut through his thoughts. Ms. Peterson towered over him, her thin lips pressed into what might generously be called a smile. Her blonde hair was pulled back so tightly it seemed to stretch her pale skin. We don't tolerate tardiness at Westfield. But the principal was showing me. First rule in my classroom, no excuses, she interrupted, holding the door open with impatience radiating from every line of her body. Marcus stepped inside, feeling 26 pairs of eyes on him. Unlike his previous public school, Westfield's student body was predominantly white. He was one of only 3 black students in the class. Class, this is Marcus Johnson. He's joining us from. Ms. Peterson consulted a paper, Lincoln Elementary. Take the empty seat in the back. Marcus moved toward the indicated desk, conscious of whispers following him. Isn't that where they had those budget cuts? My dad says those schools barely teach anything. The principal, Mr. Wilson, had seemed welcoming enough during their brief meeting. Your father's contribution to our science lab renovation is much appreciated, he'd said with a hearty handshake. We're delighted to welcome a student of your caliber. But Mr. Wilson wasn't here now as Ms. Peterson began the morning lessons, repeatedly singling out Marcus with questions. Since you're joining us mid-chapter, Marcus, perhaps you can tell us the capital of Kazakhstan? When he correctly answered Astana, her eyes narrowed slightly. It's actually Nur-Sultan now, she corrected. They renamed it in 2019. By lunch period, Marcus had already learned an important lesson. Ms. Peterson had expectations about him, and being knowledgeable wasn't one of them. As he stood in the cafeteria line, a friendly voice broke through his isolation. Hey, new kid. Wanna sit with us? A smiling boy named Jamal waved him over, offering the first genuine welcome of the day. Perhaps Westfield wouldn't be so bad after all. A week into his time at Westfield, Marcus had established a routine. He'd arrive early, review his notes to avoid Ms. Peterson's trap questions, and sit with Jamal and a few others at lunch. But everything changed during Thursday's history class. Take your seats for the quiz, Ms. Peterson announced, distributing papers. Marcus moved toward his desk but hesitated. The painful welts from yesterday's disciplinary measure made sitting excruciating. Ms. Peterson had struck him with a ruler across his lower back for disrupting class, when he'd merely corrected a mathematical error on the board. I'd prefer to stand, Ms. Peterson, he said quietly. Her eyes flashed. Sit down immediately. Ma'am, I can't. Are you defying me? Her voice rose sharply, drawing everyone's attention. No, ma'am, but I have a medical detention, Mr. Johnson. And since you insist on disrupting my class, you can hand over your lunch. My lunch? Marcus echoed in confusion. Yes. Perhaps going hungry will teach you respect. Hand it over, now. Marcus reluctantly retrieved his lunch bag from his backpack and placed it on her desk. The brown paper bag contained his favorite sandwich, turkey and avocado on whole grain bread, that his father had prepared that morning, along with fruit and a homemade cookie. You may take the quiz standing if you insist on making a spectacle of yourself, she said coldly. Marcus stood at his desk, fighting back tears of pain and humiliation as classmates stared. He couldn't focus on the questions before him. All he could think about was Ms. Peterson eating his lunch later, and what he would tell his father. During lunch period, he sat with Jamal, stomach growling. "She can't do that," Jamal whispered, sliding half his sandwich toward Marcus. "My mom says teachers aren't allowed to take food as punishment." "It's fine," Marcus lied. "I'm not even hungry." But when the bell rang at 3 p.m., Marcus saw Ms. Peterson drop his empty lunch bag into her trash can. Their eyes met briefly, and a cold smile crossed her lips. That evening, when his father asked about his day, Marcus couldn't bring himself to mention the incident. Dr. Johnson worked long hours at the hospital and was already sacrificing so much to give Marcus this better opportunity. How could he add another burden? "Fine," Marcus said, pushing food around his plate. "Everything's fine." But as he struggled to find a comfortable sleeping position that didn't press against his bruises, Marcus knew that nothing was fine at all. By the third week, a disturbing pattern had emerged. Every day, for increasingly minor infractions, Ms. Peterson would confiscate Marcus's lunch. First it was for talking back when he politely corrected a historical date. Then for dress code violation when his uniform shirt became untucked after recess. Soon, standing instead of sitting became a guaranteed excuse. "But you know why I can't sit?" Marcus had whispered desperately after class one day, his voice trembling. "All I know is that you're deliberately undermining my authority," Ms. Peterson had replied icily. "Perhaps your previous school tolerated such behavior, but at Westfield, we have standards." The physical pain from Ms. Peterson's ruler had mostly subsided, but Marcus continued to stand during her classes, now as a silent protest against her treatment. Each day, the ritual repeated: he would stand, she would demand his lunch, and he would go hungry while she smugly consumed the meals his father carefully prepared. Jamal and a few other classmates tried to help, sharing portions of their own lunches, but Marcus found it increasingly difficult to accept their charity. "You need to tell someone," Jamal urged as they sat in the library during study period. "This isn't right, Marcus." "Tell who?" "The principal thinks she's teacher of the year." "And my dad." Marcus trailed off, thinking of his father's proud face when he'd enrolled him at Westfield. "He's working double shifts just to afford this place. I can't disappoint him." "It's not your fault," Jamal insisted. "My older brother says what she's doing is discrimination." Marcus shook his head. "I can't prove that." But privately, he couldn't help noticing that none of the other students had their lunches confiscated, regardless of their behavior. Even Tyler, who regularly disrupted class with jokes and pranks, never faced the same punishment. At home, Marcus had developed strategies to hide his hunger. He claimed he was having big lunches at school while taking smaller breakfasts and dinners. He invented a school snack program to explain why he wasn't hungry in the evenings. Each lie weighed on him, adding to his growing isolation. His father, though tired from long hospital shifts, began to notice changes. "You've lost weight," Dr. Johnson observed one evening. "And your last progress report showed your grades slipping. Is everything okay at school?" "Just adjusting," Marcus mumbled. "You know you can tell me anything, right? That's our deal, honesty first, always." Marcus nodded, guilt flooding through him. Their honesty first policy had been established after his mother died 3 years ago. Through their grief, father and son had promised never to hide important things from each other. Now, Marcus was breaking that promise daily. That night, as Marcus lay in bed, his stomach aching with hunger, he heard his father on the phone in the next room. "He's not thriving like we hoped," Dr. Johnson was saying quietly. "I'm wondering if we made the right choice with Westfield." The thought of causing his father to doubt his decisions made Marcus feel even worse. Tomorrow, he decided, he would find a way to endure Ms. Peterson's treatment without letting it affect his performance. He would make his father proud, no matter the cost. What Marcus didn't realize was that the cost was becoming too high to bear alone. As October turned to November, the effects of Ms. Peterson's lunch discipline became impossible to hide. Marcus had lost nearly 10 pounds, his uniform hanging loosely on his thinning frame. Dark circles shadowed his eyes from nights spent trying to complete homework while battling hunger headaches. During a routine physical education assessment, Marcus fainted on the track. He awoke in the nurse's office with Ms. Ryan, the school counselor, sitting beside him. "Your blood sugar was dangerously low," she explained gently. "The nurse said this isn't the first time you've seemed lightheaded in her office. Is everything okay, Marcus?" He stared at the ceiling, the weight of weeks of silence crushing him. "I'm just not used to the workload," he lied. Ms. Ryan studied him carefully. "You know, I've been reviewing your file. Your previous school records show excellent academic performance and perfect attendance. Yet here, your grades are slipping, and you seem withdrawn. If something's happening, I'd like to help." For a moment, Marcus considered telling her everything: the confiscated lunches, the welts that had finally healed, the daily humiliation. But then he remembered overhearing Ms. Ryan and Ms. Peterson laughing together in the faculty lounge. They were friends. Would she even believe him? "I'm fine," he insisted, pushing himself upright. "Can I go back to class?" That evening, his father received a call from the school nurse about the fainting incident. Dr. James Johnson, chief of neurosurgery at Memorial Hospital, rarely left work early, but that day he made an exception. When Marcus arrived home, he found his father waiting in the kitchen with a plate of grilled cheese sandwiches and tomato soup, his comfort food since childhood. The nurse mentioned low blood sugar, Dr. Johnson said, his voice deliberately casual as he placed the food in front of Marcus. She also mentioned weight loss. Marcus stared at the sandwich, shame and hunger warring within him. "I've noticed you barely eating at home, claiming you're full from school lunches," his father continued. "Yet you're losing weight. Something doesn't add up, son." "Dad, it's nothing, Marcus." His father's tone stopped him. "Remember after Mom died, what we promised each other?" "Honesty first," Marcus whispered, tears filling his eyes. Dr. Johnson sat beside him, placing a gentle hand on his shoulder. "Whatever it is, we face it together. That's how we've always done it." The kindness broke something in Marcus. His shoulders began to shake as tears spilled down his cheeks. For the first time since the torment began, he allowed himself to feel the full weight of his pain and humiliation. "I'm so hungry, Dad," he admitted, his voice cracking. "All the time." "Why? What's happening to the lunches I pack you?" Marcus took a shuddering breath, but couldn't bring himself to answer. The words seemed stuck in his throat, trapped behind weeks of silence and shame. Dr. Johnson didn't press. Instead, he pulled his son into a tight embrace, holding him as sobs racked his thin body. They stayed that way for a long time, the soup growing cold beside them. "You don't have to tell me everything tonight," his father finally said. "But I need you to eat, and then rest. Tomorrow is Saturday. No school, no pressure. And when you're ready, we'll talk." That night, for the first time in weeks, Marcus slept deeply, the burden of his secret partially lifted. He didn't know what would happen when he told his father the full truth, but somehow, he felt the faintest flicker of hope. Saturday morning dawned crisp and clear. Dr. Johnson, usually called in for weekend surgeries, had cleared his schedule. When Marcus shuffled into the kitchen, he found his father making blueberry pancakes, another comfort food from happier days. "Sit," Dr. Johnson said, sliding a stack onto a plate. "Eat first, talk second." Marcus obeyed, his body gratefully accepting the nourishment. As he ate, his father refilled his plate without comment, twice. When Marcus finally pushed back from the table, feeling properly full for the first time in weeks, Dr. Johnson poured them both hot chocolate and sat across from him. "Now," he said gently. "Start from the beginning." The story poured out of Marcus in a rush, the initial ruler strikes across his back when he had corrected a math problem, the pain that made sitting unbearable, his decision to stand instead, and Ms. Peterson's retaliatory pattern of confiscating his lunches. 23 lunches, Marcus concluded. That's how many she's taken since September. His father's expression remained carefully neutral, though a muscle twitched in his jaw. And the other students? Does she take their lunches too? Marcus shook his head. Just mine. Has she struck any other students with a ruler? No. At least, not that I've seen. Dr. Johnson took a slow, deliberate breath. Why didn't you tell me sooner? Marcus stared into his mug. You were so happy about getting me into Westfield. You've been working extra shifts to pay the tuition. I didn't want to disappoint you. Marcus, look at me. His father waited until their eyes met. Nothing is more important to me than your well-being. Not a fancy school, not what others think, nothing. Do you understand? Marcus nodded, feeling both relieved and ashamed. I want you to know something, Dr. Johnson continued. What this teacher has done is wrong on every level. It's abuse, it's discrimination, and it stops now. What are you going to do? Marcus asked, anxiety creeping back into his voice. His father's eyes held a determined gleam that Marcus recognized from challenging medical cases. First, I'm going to document everything. Those welts on your back, they've healed. Marcus nodded. We'll need to have our family doctor examine you and make a record of your weight loss and nutritional status. Dr. Johnson was thinking aloud now. Then, we'll need witnesses. You mentioned your friend Jamal has seen some of this. And a few others, Marcus confirmed. But what if no one believes us? Ms. Peterson is really popular with the other teachers and the principal. Dr. Johnson's expression softened. Son, I need you to trust me. I won't let anyone hurt you again, not her, not anyone. But I need a little time to handle this the right way. You mean we're going to report her? Marcus asked. Eventually. But first, his father said, a new resolve hardening his features, I think Ms. Peterson needs a taste of her own medicine. And I have just the prescription in mind. Dr. Johnson spent the remainder of the weekend making calls, to the family attorney, to their family physician, and to several colleagues at the hospital. Marcus overheard fragments of conversations, his father's normally calm voice occasionally rising with controlled anger. Yes, deliberate starvation of a child. No, the school administration hasn't been notified yet. Documented weight loss of nearly 12 pounds in 6 weeks. Yes, physical evidence of the corporal punishment has healed, but we have the dates recorded. On Sunday evening, Dr. Johnson called Marcus into his home office. Spread across his desk were printouts of school policies, state education laws, and medical documentation. I want to discuss my plan with you, he said, gesturing for Marcus to sit. You have a right to know what's happening and to have a say in it. Marcus sat cautiously, still not entirely comfortable after weeks of standing in class. Are we suing the school? Eventually, that may be necessary, his father acknowledged. But legal processes are slow, and you'd still have to face Ms. Peterson every day while the case proceeded. I have something more immediate in mind. He slid a document across the desk, Westfield Academy's Teacher Code of Conduct. One paragraph was highlighted, under no circumstances shall food be withheld as a form of punishment. Nutrition is recognized as essential to student learning and well-being. She's breaking their own rules, Marcus observed. Exactly. And according to your classmates' parents, whom I've spoken with discreetly, this isn't the first time. But administrators have dismissed previous complaints because of Ms. Peterson's connections. Her father sits on the school board. Marcus's heart sank. So nothing will happen to her. Dr. Johnson's smile held an edge Marcus rarely saw, the expression he imagined his father wore in the operating room when faced with a particularly challenging surgical case. Oh, something will definitely happen. You see, while legal channels move slowly, public embarrassment and professional disgrace happen quite quickly. But for this to work, I need your cooperation. What do I have to do? Marcus asked. Continue exactly as you have been, stand instead of sit, remain respectful despite her provocations. Let her take your lunch tomorrow. Marcus's stomach clenched at the thought. Dad, I don't think I can handle another day without food. You won't have to. Dr. Johnson reached into his briefcase and removed a small nutrition bar. Keep this in your pocket for emergencies. But trust me when I say Ms. Peterson won't be enjoying her stolen lunch tomorrow. He outlined the plan, explaining each step carefully. As Marcus listened, his anxiety gradually transformed into something else, not quite excitement, but a sense of justice long overdue. What about after? Marcus asked. Won't she just punish me worse once she realizes what happened? She won't have the chance, his father assured him. I've arranged to take the entire week off work. Tomorrow morning, I'll drop you at school as usual. But I'll be returning shortly after, with reinforcements. That night, Marcus watched his father preparing his lunch with meticulous care, wearing latex gloves and measuring ingredients with the precision of a pharmacist. The ordinary brown paper bag looked identical to those of previous weeks, but its contents were anything but typical. Remember, Dr. Johnson said as they finished, this isn't about revenge. It's about justice, and making sure no other child faces what you've endured. As Marcus lay in bed that night, for the first time in weeks, he felt something other than dread about the coming school day. Whatever his father had planned, he trusted that tomorrow would be different. What he couldn't know was just how different it would be, or how completely Ms. Peterson's reign of terror was about to end. Monday morning arrived with a peculiar sense of anticipation. As Dr. Johnson prepared breakfast, Marcus noticed his father's movements were precise, almost ceremonial. There was something different about him today, a focused intensity beneath his usual calm demeanor. Nervous? Dr. Johnson asked, placing a protein-rich breakfast before Marcus. A little, Marcus admitted. What exactly is in that lunch? His father's smile was enigmatic. Nothing dangerous or harmful. Just, educational. The important thing is that you follow our plan exactly. When she takes your lunch, don't protest too much. Just enough to make it seem normal. As they drove to school, Dr. Johnson reviewed the timing once more. I'll be arriving at precisely 11:45 with Principal Wilson. Your lunch period begins at noon. That gives us 15 minutes to complete the preliminary discussions before the main event. What if she doesn't take my lunch today? Marcus asked. She will, his father replied with certainty. People like Ms. Peterson are predictable in their cruelty. They need it, feed on it. She won't pass up an opportunity to exert power over you. At the school entrance, Dr. Johnson gave Marcus's shoulder a reassuring squeeze. Remember what we discussed. No matter what happens, stay calm and dignified. That's how we win, not by descending to her level, but by exposing it for what it is. Marcus nodded, clutching the brown paper bag that felt strangely heavier than usual. As he walked through the school gates, he glanced back to see his father watching intently, phone in hand. Morning classes passed in a blur of anxiety and anticipation. Marcus found it difficult to concentrate, his mind constantly returning to the mysterious lunch in his backpack and his father's cryptic plan. By the time history class with Ms. Peterson arrived before lunch period, his heart was pounding so loudly he was certain everyone could hear it. Take your seats and open your textbooks to page 127, Ms. Peterson instructed as students filed in. Marcus remained standing at his desk, as had become his habit. Immediately, Ms. Peterson's gaze locked onto him like a predator spotting wounded prey. Mr. Johnson, she said with exaggerated patience, I believe I asked everyone to be seated. I prefer to stand, Ms. Peterson, Marcus replied, his voice steadier than he felt. Her smile was cold. Your preferences are irrelevant in my classroom. Either sit down immediately or surrender your lunch as usual. From the corner of his eye, Marcus saw Jamal shift uncomfortably in his seat. Several other students were watching now, the daily ritual having become a source of morbid fascination. I can't sit down, Marcus said, injecting just enough defiance into his voice to provoke her. Ms. Peterson strode to his desk, hand extended. Then you know the consequences. Hand it over. With deliberate slowness, Marcus reached into his backpack and withdrew the brown paper bag. He hesitated just long enough to make it seem like reluctance before placing it in her waiting hand. "One day you'll learn that rules exist for a reason," she said loudly enough for the entire class to hear. "Until then, perhaps hunger will be a more effective teacher than I've been." She placed the bag on her desk with triumphant finality before continuing the lesson. Marcus caught Jamal's eye and gave a subtle nod. Everything was proceeding exactly as his father had predicted. Now they just had to wait for noon, when Ms. Peterson would open the special lunch that Dr. Johnson had so carefully prepared. At precisely 12 o'clock, the lunch bell rang. Students gathered their belongings, filing out of the classroom with the eager energy of the perpetually hungry. Marcus moved slowly, deliberately taking his time as Ms. Peterson settled behind her desk and reached for the brown paper bag. "Aren't you going to lunch, Mr. Johnson?" she asked with mock concern. "Oh, that's right, you have none today." Jamal hesitated at the door. "Come on, Marcus," he called. "You can share mine." "How touching," Ms. Peterson remarked dryly. "Such charity. Run along, both of you." "I forgot my science notebook," Marcus said, pretending to search his desk. "You go ahead, Jamal." Jamal left reluctantly, closing the door behind him. Now it was just Marcus and Ms. Peterson in the classroom, exactly as planned. With theatrical relish, Ms. Peterson opened the brown bag and peered inside. "Your father does pack a nice lunch," she commented, removing the carefully wrapped sandwich. "Much too good for a boy who doesn't know his place." She unwrapped the sandwich and took a large bite, maintaining eye contact with Marcus as she chewed. Then, her expression changed. Confusion flickered across her face, followed by a grimace. "What is this?" she demanded, her voice rising as she spat the partially chewed bite into her hand. "My lunch," Marcus replied innocently. Ms. Peterson's face was contorting now, her eyes watering. "This is," she gasped, reaching frantically for her water bottle. "What did you put in this sandwich?" The door to the classroom opened. Principal Wilson stepped in, followed by Dr. Johnson in his full medical attire, white coat, stethoscope, hospital ID prominently displayed. "Ghost pepper sauce," Dr. Johnson said calmly. "Mixed with a non-toxic blue food dye. A special recipe I prepared myself this morning, while wearing gloves, of course. 1 drop is enough to make your mouth feel like it's on fire. I believe I used 5. Ms. Peterson gulped water desperately, blue stains spreading across her lips and onto her blouse. "Who are," she sputtered between gasps. "Dr. James Johnson, Chief of Neurosurgery at Memorial Hospital," he introduced himself, voice professionally detached. "Also, Marcus's father. The father whose son you've been systematically starving for the past 6 weeks." Principal Wilson's face paled. "Dr. Johnson, I assure you, I had no knowledge of." "Didn't you?" Dr. Johnson interrupted, his tone still eerily calm. 23 documented incidents of food confiscation. 12 pounds of weight loss in a minor under your care. Not to mention the physical abuse with a ruler that left welts on my son's back, the reason he couldn't sit in class without pain." Ms. Peterson had stopped sputtering now, her face a mixture of pain, shock, and dawning horror. "You have no proof," she managed, though her voice lacked conviction. "Don't I?" Dr. Johnson produced a folder. Medical documentation of Marcus's weight loss and nutritional deficiencies. Dated photographs of the welts on his back. Sworn statements from 5 of his classmates who witnessed you taking his lunches repeatedly. And now, he gestured to her blue-stained mouth and the partially eaten sandwich, irrefutable evidence that you consumed food intended for a child under your care, contrary to both school policy and basic human decency. Principal Wilson was visibly sweating now. "Ms. Peterson, is this true?" Before she could answer, the classroom door opened again. A woman in a business suit entered, followed by 2 uniformed police officers. "Laura Chen, Department of Child Protective Services," she introduced herself briskly. We received a detailed report from Dr. Johnson yesterday. I see his information appears to be accurate. The classroom had become the stage for a drama unlike any Westfield Academy had seen before. Ms. Peterson, her lips and tongue stained bright blue from the dye in the sandwich, sat frozen behind her desk. Principal Wilson stood awkwardly between Dr. Johnson and the door, as if unsure whether to defend his teacher or distance himself from her. "This is absurd," Ms. Peterson finally sputtered, finding her voice. "I was simply enforcing school discipline." The boy was deliberately disruptive, refusing to sit. "Because you had struck him with a ruler across his back," Dr. Johnson interrupted, his calm voice belying the anger in his eyes. "The welts made sitting painful. A fact you were well aware of, since you caused the injury." "Corporal punishment is strictly forbidden at Westfield," Principal Wilson said, his face ashen. "Ms. Peterson, we've never authorized." "Oh, spare me the performance, Wilson," Dr. Johnson cut in. "My son reported the incident to your office the day it happened. According to your secretary, you dismissed it as an exaggeration and took no action." The Child Protective Services officer was making notes on a tablet. "Mr. Wilson, if that's accurate, you may also face charges for failure to report suspected child abuse." The principal's professional demeanor crumbled. "There must be some misunderstanding. Ms. Peterson has been with us for 15 years, she's the daughter of our board chairman." "Ah, and there it is," Dr. Johnson said. "The real reason her behavior has been tolerated all these years. Connections." Ms. Peterson stood abruptly, her chair scraping loudly against the floor. "This is ridiculous. You have no actual proof beyond a child's word against mine. And this," she gestured to her blue-stained mouth, "this is assault. You poisoned me." "Ghost pepper is a food, not a poison," Dr. Johnson replied evenly. "Spicy, certainly, but consumed by millions daily. The food dye is FDA approved and commonly used in children's candies. Nothing I put in that sandwich was harmful, unlike starvation, which can cause lasting damage to a developing child." He turned to the CPS officer. "In my medical opinion, Ms. Peterson is experiencing the temporary discomfort of capsaicin exposure. It will subside within 20 to 30 minutes with no lasting effects. Unlike the psychological trauma and physical effects of systematic food deprivation, which my son has endured for weeks." One of the police officers stepped forward. "Ms. Peterson, we'd like you to come to the station to provide a statement regarding these allegations." "This is outrageous," she protested, her voice rising. "Do you know who my father is?" "I believe that's precisely the problem," Dr. Johnson said quietly. "Everyone here knows exactly who your father is, and they've allowed that knowledge to corrupt their professional judgment and ethical obligations to protect children." He turned to Marcus, who had been watching the scene unfold with wide eyes. "Son, would you please wait outside for a moment? Ms. Chin would like to speak with you privately, and I need to finish my conversation with Principal Wilson and Ms. Peterson." As Marcus stepped into the hallway, he found Jamal and several other classmates waiting anxiously. Word had spread throughout the lunchroom about the police presence at the school. "Is it true?" Jamal asked. "Your dad's a doctor." Marcus nodded, a strange mixture of pride and embarrassment washing over him. "Chief of neurosurgery at Memorial." "Whoa," another classmate whispered. "No wonder he came up with such a crazy plan." Through the closed door, they could hear Ms. Peterson's voice rising hysterically as the gravity of her situation became clear. Years of unchecked behavior were finally catching up to her, and no amount of family connections could erase the blue evidence staining her face. The aftermath unfolded with a swiftness that left the entire school reeling. Ms. Peterson was escorted from the building by the police officers, her blue-stained face partially hidden behind her hand, while students watched from classroom windows. Principal Wilson remained closeted in his office with the school board's emergency response team for hours afterward. By the following morning, the story had reached the local news: prestigious academy teacher accused of abusing and starving student. The headline ran alongside a statement from Westfield Academy expressing deep concern and announcing Ms. Peterson's immediate suspension pending investigation. Dr. Johnson had transformed overnight from an anonymous parent to a force to be reckoned with. When he arrived to accompany Marcus to school the next day, teachers and administrators alike regarded him with a mixture of respect and apprehension. Dr. Johnson, the interim principal, Dr. Martinez, greeted them at the entrance. "I want to personally assure you that we're taking this situation with the utmost seriousness. We've assigned Marcus to a different classroom, and we're conducting a full review of all disciplinary practices." "That's a start," Dr. Johnson replied calmly. "But as I outlined in my email last night, I expect a comprehensive plan addressing not just this isolated incident, but the systemic failures that allowed it to occur." "Of course," Dr. Martinez said hurriedly. "The board is convening an emergency session this afternoon. Your suggested reforms will be the primary agenda item." As they walked through the hallways, Marcus noticed how differently people looked at him now. Students who had previously ignored him offered tentative smiles. Teachers who had been indifferent now greeted him by name. It was as though his father's intervention had made him visible in a way he hadn't been before. His new homeroom teacher, Mr. Bradley, welcomed him warmly. "Choose any seat you like, Marcus. Standing or sitting, whatever's comfortable for you." By lunchtime, the school was buzzing with rumors and speculation. Marcus found Jamal waiting for him at their usual table, along with several other students who had never sat with them before. "Your dad is all over social media," one girl informed him, holding out her phone to show Marcus a video of Dr. Johnson giving a statement outside the police station. "He's being called a hero for standing up to the whole system. Did you know he was on the hospital board that donated the science lab equipment?" another student added. "My mom says the school never even thanked him properly." Marcus hadn't known that. In fact, he was discovering there was much about his father's influence and connections he hadn't appreciated until now. After school, a crowd of reporters had gathered at the edge of school property. Dr. Johnson navigated through them expertly, declining to comment beyond a brief statement. "This case isn't about publicity. It's about protecting children and holding institutions accountable." At home, the phone rang constantly with calls from parents, education advocates, and even a representative from the governor's education task force. Dr. Johnson handled each one with the same measured professionalism, never raising his voice but never backing down from his demands for reform. "The school board is meeting tonight," he told Marcus as they sat down for dinner. "Ms. Peterson's father has recused himself, and they're voting on a new set of accountability measures." "What will happen to her?" Marcus asked, finally voicing the question that had been troubling him. "She's facing criminal charges for child abuse," his father replied honestly. "But more importantly, she'll never be in a position to harm another student. The state licensing board is already reviewing her teaching credentials." "And Principal Wilson?" "He's been placed on administrative leave while they investigate his failure to act on your initial report." Dr. Johnson studied his son carefully. "How are you feeling about all this?" Marcus considered the question. "It's weird. Part of me feels bad about what's happening to them. But another part feels relieved. Vindicated." Marcus nodded. "Is that wrong?" "No, son. It's entirely natural to have mixed feelings. What happened to you was wrong, and those responsible should face consequences. But taking pleasure in another's downfall isn't something we want to cultivate." He reached across the table and squeezed Marcus's hand. "The true victory here isn't their punishment, it's the changes that will protect other students in the future." "Like what?" "Anonymous reporting systems for students. Regular independent reviews of disciplinary practices. Mandatory documentation of all punishments." Dr. Johnson smiled slightly. "And a strict prohibition on teachers consuming students' lunches, explicitly written into the code of conduct." That night, as Marcus prepared for bed, he realized he was looking forward to school the next day for the first time in months. The fear that had become his constant companion was finally beginning to recede, replaced by something that felt almost like hope. When Marcus returned to school the following week, the atmosphere had transformed. Interim Principal Dr. Martinez had implemented immediate changes, an anonymous reporting system for students, transparent disciplinary procedures, and most significantly for Marcus, a nutritionist-designed meal program ensuring no student ever went hungry, regardless of circumstances. His new homeroom teacher, Mr. Bradley, approached education differently from Ms. Peterson. Rather than seeking to embarrass students who answered incorrectly, he celebrated questions and treated mistakes as valuable learning opportunities. "Marcus, I noticed your analysis of the historical context is quite insightful," Mr. Bradley commented, returning a recent assignment. "Have you considered joining the debate team?" Such encouragement was still unfamiliar, almost uncomfortable after months of Ms. Peterson's criticism. But gradually, Marcus began to reclaim his academic confidence. Jamal remained his steadfast friend, but their lunch table had expanded. Students who had previously ignored or avoided Marcus now sought his company, impressed by the courage it had taken to stand up against an established teacher. "Your dad changed everything," Jamal said one afternoon as they walked home. "Not just for you, but for everyone. Tyler's sister was in Ms. Peterson's class 3 years ago, says she used to make her cry every day. No one ever did anything about it until your dad came along." The changes extended beyond Westfield. Dr. Johnson had become an unexpected advocate for educational reform, his medical credentials lending weight to his calls for greater accountability in schools. News outlets featured stories about similar cases across the district, previously buried by administrative indifference or intimidation. At home, the bond between father and son had deepened. Their "honesty first" policy evolved into nightly discussions where they shared the day's challenges and triumphs. "Ms. Chen from CPS called today," Dr. Johnson mentioned one evening. "The investigation is proceeding. They may need you to make a formal statement next week." Marcus nodded, no longer afraid of telling his story. "I'm ready." "There's something else," his father continued. "Ms. Peterson's attorney has requested a meeting. They're offering a settlement if we drop the criminal charges." "What did you tell them?" "That it's not my decision alone." "What do you think we should do?" The question took Marcus by surprise. Adults rarely asked for his opinion on serious matters. "I don't want money," he said after thoughtful consideration. "But I don't know if I want her to go to jail either. What would help other kids the most?" Dr. Johnson smiled, pride evident in his expression. "That's exactly the right question to ask. I think a public acknowledgement of wrongdoing, permanent surrender of her teaching credentials, and mandatory ethics training would serve the greater good more effectively than incarceration." "Then that's what we should ask for," Marcus decided. As winter approached, Marcus's physical health improved. The weight he'd lost returned, and with it, his natural energy and enthusiasm. The nightmares about Ms. Peterson gradually subsided, replaced by dreams of future possibilities. One afternoon, Mr. Bradley held him back after class. "I submitted your history paper to the State Educational Journal Student Showcase," he said. "They want to publish it next month." This recognition, earned through genuine merit rather than favoritism or fear, meant more to Marcus than any previous achievement. That evening, as he shared the news with his father, he realized how far he'd come from those dark days of hunger and humiliation. "I'm proud of you," Dr. Johnson said simply. "Not just for your academic success, but for how you've handled everything these past months. Your mother would be proud too." The mention of his mother, rare but treasured, warmed Marcus deeply. He could almost imagine her smile, the way she'd always believed in standing up for what was right, no matter the cost. The healing had truly begun. Spring sunshine bathed the Westfield Academy courtyard as students gathered for the annual Honors Day celebration. Marcus, now in 8th grade, sat beside his father in the front row, listening as Dr. Martinez addressed the assembled parents and students. "1 year ago, our school faced a reckoning," the principal said solemnly. "We were forced to confront failures in our systems, our oversight, and our culture. Today, I'm proud to say that Westfield hasn't merely recovered from that crisis, we've emerged stronger, more compassionate, and more committed to student well-being." Dr. Johnson nodded subtly in acknowledgement. Many of the changes implemented over the past year had come from his recommendations, now being adopted by schools throughout the district. Our first award today, Dr. Martinez continued, is the new Advocacy and Courage Award, given to a student who demonstrates exceptional moral courage in standing up for themselves and others. This year's inaugural recipient is Marcus Johnson. Applause erupted as Marcus made his way to the podium, momentarily overwhelmed by the cheers of his peers. The shy, intimidated boy who had once stood alone against injustice had transformed into a confident young leader who headed the Student Advisory Council and mentored new students. After the ceremony, as families mingled in the courtyard, Marcus noticed a familiar figure hovering uncertainly at the edge of the crowd. It took him a moment to recognize her, Ms. Peterson, considerably thinner, her once imperious posture now diminished. She approached cautiously, stopping a respectful distance away. "Marcus," she said quietly. "Dr. Johnson. I hope I'm not intruding." Dr. Johnson's expression remained neutral. "That depends on your purpose here." "I wanted to apologize, in person." Her voice trembled slightly. "The court-mandated therapy has helped me understand the harm I caused. I don't expect forgiveness, but I wanted you to know that your actions forced me to confront patterns I've been perpetuating for years." Marcus studied his former teacher. The woman who had once loomed so threateningly in his life now seemed smaller, almost fragile. The anger he'd expected to feel gave way to something more complex, not forgiveness exactly, but a recognition of human frailty. "What are you doing now?" he asked. "Community service at a food bank," she replied with a hint of irony. "And taking courses in restorative justice. My teaching days are over, but perhaps I can still contribute somehow." Dr. Johnson placed a protective hand on Marcus's shoulder. "Growth often comes from our most painful experiences. I hope you find your way forward." As Ms. Peterson walked away, Marcus felt a curious sense of closure. The cycle that had begun with that first confiscated lunch had come full circle, transforming not just his life but an entire community. "Ready to go, son?" his father asked. "We've got that meeting with the State Education Committee this afternoon." Marcus nodded, thinking of the testimony he would give about student welfare policies. His personal experience had become a catalyst for change far beyond anything he could have imagined when he first entered Westfield's doors. As they walked to the car, Jamal called out, "See you tomorrow, Marcus. Don't forget, student council planning session at lunch." "I'll be there," Marcus called back, smiling at the mention of lunch, no longer a source of anxiety but simply another opportunity to gather with friends. Some scars remained, invisible but present. Yet Marcus had learned that healing didn't mean erasing painful experiences, it meant transforming them into something meaningful. The hunger he'd once endured had awakened a different kind of hunger, for justice, for change, for a world where no child would have to suffer in silence. And that, he reflected as he glanced at his father, was a legacy worth building. Dear friend, this story highlights the devastating impact of unchecked discrimination in our educational institutions and the courage needed to stand up against it. No child should ever face humiliation, physical punishment, or food deprivation at school. If you witness injustice, speak up. Silence only protects the perpetrators. Remember, our children learn from our actions. When we fight for justice with dignity and intelligence rather than revenge, we teach them the most powerful lesson of all, that positive change is possible even in the face of deep-rooted prejudice. Please like this video and subscribe to our channel for more inspiring stories that spark important conversations about equality and justice in our communities. You are paid to clean, not to think. The professor's words echoed through the lecture hall as he publicly humiliated the black janitor who dared to solve a complex equation. But when a young man with a back injury stood at the rear of the prestigious Stanford lecture, unable to sit due to a teacher's cruelty, no one expected him to approach the whiteboard and expose their mathematical genius. "My father cleans your office," he revealed, silencing the room. What happens when brilliant minds are overlooked simply because of who they are or what they look like? How many invisible geniuses walk among us, dismissed because they don't fit our narrow definition of intelligence? This story will change how you see everyone around you. Dear viewer, if you are watching my story for the first time, I humbly request you write the location from where you are watching right now, subscribe this channel and press the bell icon now not to miss the notifications of my daily published news stories. Thank you, and let's dive into the full story. The marble floors of Stanford University's mathematics department gleamed under the fluorescent lights as Professor Richard Wellington strode confidently down the corridor. His Italian leather shoes clicked rhythmically against the polished surface, a sound he'd grown to associate with his own importance. At 52, Wellington was the crown jewel of Stanford's mathematics faculty, a Fields Medal nominee with 3 published books and a reputation that preceded him across academic circles worldwide. His salt and pepper hair was perfectly coiffed, his tailored suits always immaculate, and his wire-rimmed glasses perched precisely on his narrow nose. "Professor Wellington," called out Dr. Chen, a younger faculty member, hurrying to catch up. "The department meeting has been moved to 4 o'clock, I know," Wellington replied without slowing his pace. "I requested to change myself. The Princeton Review Board is calling at 3. The younger professor nodded deferentially. Everyone accommodated Wellington's schedule. It was an unspoken rule. As the 2 professors turned the corner, they nearly collided with a cleaning cart. Behind it stood Marcus Johnson, a tall black man in his mid-40s wearing the gray uniform of the university's custodial staff. "My apologies, Professor," Marcus said quietly, moving his cart aside. Wellington barely acknowledged him with a curt nod before continuing his conversation with Dr. Chen. Marcus was virtually invisible to him, just another service worker maintaining the backdrop to his academic achievements. What Wellington failed to notice was the way Marcus's eyes lingered on the mathematical equations scrawled across the glass-enclosed bulletin board. Or how, when the professors disappeared down the hallway, Marcus stepped closer to examine the complex formulas with genuine interest. Later that night, when the building had emptied of its prestigious occupants, Marcus pushed his cleaning cart through the silent halls. He paused outside Wellington's office, where the door stood ajar. The professor often worked late, but his office was now dark except for the soft glow of a desk lamp illuminating a whiteboard covered in equations. Marcus glanced around to ensure he was alone before stepping inside. He wasn't being nosy, cleaning the offices was part of his job. But as he emptied the wastepaper basket, his gaze was drawn to the whiteboard. A complex mathematical problem sprawled across its surface, with frustrated erasure marks visible at various points. Marcus tilted his head, studying the equation with an intensity that would have shocked Professor Wellington had he been present to witness it. For 15 years, Marcus had cleaned these halls, silently absorbing the mathematics that surrounded him. Not once had anyone asked if he understood what he was erasing from the boards each night. Not once had they considered that the man who polished their floors might also have a mind that could polish their theorems. Marcus allowed himself 5 minutes, just 5, to stand before the board, his eyes tracing the patterns of symbols with the practice of someone who had spent countless nights doing exactly this. Then, with a small sigh, he returned to his cart and continued his rounds, invisible once more in the halls of prestige. Professor Wellington slammed his hand against his desk, causing his graduate students to jump. "No, no, and no. You're approaching it all wrong, Parker." The whiteboard before them was covered with attempts at solving what had become known in their department as Wellington's paradox, a mathematical problem the professor had been working on for nearly 2 years. It related to computational complexity theory and, if solved, could potentially revolutionize certain aspects of computer science. "But Professor," ventured Sophia Lee, his most promising doctoral candidate, "what if we approached it from a nonlinear perspective?" She stepped forward tentatively, marker in hand. Wellington sighed dramatically. "Go ahead. Though I've explored that avenue extensively." The clock ticked past 10 p.m. as the small group of elite graduate students continued their work. Outside the window, a gentle rain began to fall, casting shimmering reflections on the campus pathways. None of them noticed Marcus begin his evening shift, pushing his cart silently past the office door. "I'm calling it a night," Wellington finally announced, rubbing his temples. "Leave your notes. We'll reconvene tomorrow." The students gathered their belongings, exchanging glances that mixed exhaustion with frustration. Their professor's brilliance was undeniable, but his impatience made collaboration difficult. As they filed out, Marcus entered with his cleaning supplies. "Evening, Professor," he said politely. Wellington barely glanced up from packing his briefcase. "Yes, fine. Don't erase the board." "Never do unless instructed, sir," Marcus replied, though Wellington was already walking out, mind elsewhere. Alone in the office, Marcus began his routine, emptying trash bins, vacuuming, wiping surfaces. But his eyes kept returning to the equation on the board. Tonight's version had new elements, new approaches that had ultimately been crossed out in frustration. Marcus pulled out his phone and took a quick photo of the board, something he'd done periodically over the months. Not to steal intellectual property, but because the problem had begun living in his mind too. At 1 a.m., Marcus finally returned home to his modest apartment in East Palo Alto. Despite the late hour, a light still burned in the living room where his son, Elijah, lay on a specially designed ergonomic floor mat, surrounded by books. "Hey, Dad," Elijah said, looking up with a smile that transformed his serious face. At 17, he had his father's height and lean build, with keen intelligent eyes that missed nothing. "Still up with your back pain?" Marcus asked, concern lining his face. Elijah nodded. "Can't sit at the desk tonight. The spasm started during my online calculus class." Marcus's jaw tightened. The injury that caused his son's chronic back pain had come from an incident 3 years ago, when a teacher had forced Elijah to sit for hours in detention as punishment for correcting her during an advanced mathematics class. The woman had pushed him back down each time he tried to stand to relieve his discomfort, ultimately causing a herniated disc that never properly healed. "I brought you something," Marcus said, pulling out his phone and showing Elijah the photo of Wellington's equation. "They're still stuck on this over at the university." Elijah's eyes lit up as he studied the problem. "They're overcomplicating the approach," he murmured, reaching for his notebook. "Look at this section here, they keep trying to force a solution through conventional methods." Marcus smiled as he watched his son work, pride and sadness mingling in his chest. Elijah's mathematical genius had been evident since he was a toddler, but the educational system had failed him repeatedly. Now he was completing his high school diploma online while self-studying university-level mathematics. As Marcus prepared for bed, exhaustion weighing heavy on his shoulders, he thought about the unsolved equation and the brilliant mind struggling with it, never suspecting that the solution might come from the janitor who cleaned their offices and his son who couldn't sit in a classroom chair. The following week brought unusual warmth to the Stanford campus. Students sprawled on the grass, professors held seminars outdoors, and even the usually austere mathematics building seemed less intimidating with sunshine streaming through its windows. Marcus arrived for his shift early, using the extra time to sit on a bench outside the building. From his worn backpack, he pulled out a notebook, not the institutional cleaning log one might expect, but a personal journal filled with mathematical notations. For 15 years, Marcus had been pursuing his own education in these stolen moments. What had begun as curiosity had evolved into passion, and then into a private discipline that sustained him through long nights of thankless work. A memory surfaced as he reviewed his notes on Wellington's paradox. He was 18 again, sitting in a community college classroom, his mind racing ahead of the instructor's explanations. Marcus had been the first in his family bound for higher education, earning a partial scholarship to study mathematics at a state university. Then life intervened. His mother's illness, the mounting medical bills, the need for immediate income. One semester became a lifetime of deferred dreams. He took the janitorial position at Stanford, temporary, he'd thought, just until things stabilized. Now, decades later, he still roamed these halls after dark, not as the mathematician he might have been, but as the invisible man who emptied the trash cans of those who had the opportunities he'd been denied. Marcus closed his notebook as students began filtering past him. No one gave him a second glance in his custodial uniform. He was part of the landscape, as overlooked as the trees or benches. That night, as rain returned to the campus, Marcus found himself once again in Professor Wellington's office. The whiteboard showed signs of renewed frustration, multiple sections erased and rewritten, circles and arrows connecting disparate parts of the equation. Marcus studied it intently. For weeks, he'd been following the progression of attempts, and something had been crystallizing in his mind. The approach felt wrong, too constrained by conventional thinking. If they just shifted perspective. He glanced at the clock, 2:13 a.m. Everyone had gone home hours ago. Hesitantly, he picked up a marker. This was crossing a line. This was not his place. And yet. Marcus uncapped the marker and, in the bottom right corner of the board, added a small annotation, an alternative approach to one section of the equation. He wrote neatly but small, his contribution almost hidden unless someone was specifically looking for it. Not a complete solution, just a nudge in a different direction. He recapped the marker, heart pounding. What was he doing? He could lose his job for this presumption. And yet, the mathematics called to him with a voice as clear and compelling as any he'd ever heard. Later that night, Marcus showed Elijah a photo of the modified equation. You actually wrote on his board? Elijah asked, eyes wide with equal parts admiration and concern. Just a small note, Marcus said. Probably won't even notice it. Elijah studied the photo. Dad, this is brilliant. You've identified the fundamental flaw in their approach. He looked up at his father. You could have been one of them, you know. Should have been. Marcus smiled sadly. Different path, different life. He squeezed his son's shoulder. But you're going to walk through those doors one day as their equal. Elijah's expression darkened. Not if they're all like the teachers I've had. The memory of Elijah's injury hung between them. The young math teacher who couldn't accept being corrected by a black student. The hours forced to sit still as punishment. The medical bills they still struggled to pay. Not all of them are like that, Marcus said, trying to believe it himself. Enough of them are, Elijah replied, turning back to the equation. But this is elegant, Dad. If Wellington has any real insight, he'll see it. Marcus nodded, but doubt crept in. Would someone like Richard Wellington ever truly see him? Or would he remain invisible, the way he had been for 15 years, just a shadow passing through the halls of brilliance without leaving a trace? Little did he know that his small annotation would crack open the door to a confrontation that would change both their lives. The next morning, Professor Wellington arrived earlier than usual. He'd been plagued by dreams of unsolved equations, his subconscious refusing to let go of the mathematical puzzle even in sleep. He unlocked his office, flipped on the lights, and immediately approached the whiteboard. Something was different. His eyes narrowed as they focused on the small notation in the bottom corner, an elegant reformulation of one section of his equation. Wellington leaned closer, studying the unfamiliar handwriting. It wasn't from any of his graduate students. He knew their mathematical signatures as well as he knew their faces. What is this? He muttered, tracing the notation with his finger. The approach was unexpected, unorthodox even, but as he followed the logic, his pulse quickened. This small adjustment opened possibilities he hadn't considered. The door opened behind him as Sophia and two other graduate students arrived. Professor, we had some thoughts about, Sophia began, then noticed his intense focus on the board. Who wrote this? Wellington demanded, pointing to the corner notation. The students exchanged confused glances. None of us, sir, Parker replied. We left when you did last night. Wellington's face darkened. Someone has been in my office. Someone has been tampering with my work. As if on cue, there was a soft knock at the open door. Marcus stood there with his cleaning cart. Morning, Professor. Just need to empty your trash before the day starts. Wellington's eyes darted between Marcus and the equation. A sudden, ridiculous thought occurred to him, and he almost laughed aloud. But instead, he found himself asking, Johnson, did you see anyone in my office last night? Anyone at the whiteboard? Marcus kept his expression neutral. No, sir. Building was empty when I cleaned. Wellington nodded dismissively, turning back to the board. But something made him glance back, perhaps the way Marcus's eyes lingered on the equation for just a moment too long. You're looking at my work rather intently for a man who empties trash bins, Wellington said, his tone sharp. The graduate students shifted uncomfortably. Just admiring the complexity, sir, Marcus replied evenly. Wellington laughed, a short, harsh sound. Admiring? Do you even understand what you're looking at? Marcus hesitated. I've seen it develop over the weeks. Seen it develop? Wellington's voice rose incredulously. He turned to his students. Do you hear that? Our janitor has been seeing it develop. Perhaps he'd like to offer his insights. The sarcasm was cutting. Sophia looked embarrassed. Professor, perhaps. No, I'm curious now. Wellington gestured grandly toward the board. Mr. Janitor, what do you think of the computational complexity problem that has stumped some of the finest mathematical minds at Stanford? The room fell silent. The graduate students stared at their shoes. Marcus stood perfectly still, his dignity a palpable force in the room. I think, Marcus said carefully, that sometimes a problem needs fresh eyes. Wellington's face flushed. Fresh eyes? Fresh eyes? He stepped closer to Marcus. Do you know who I am? The qualifications required to even approach this level of mathematics? I meant no disrespect, Professor, Marcus said, his voice steady despite the humiliation burning in his chest. Yet you offer fresh eyes, Wellington mocked. Next you'll tell me you wrote this notation. He jabbed his finger at the corner of the board. The momentary flicker in Marcus's eyes was all Wellington needed. You. Wellington's voice dropped to a dangerous whisper. You dared to write on my board? It was late. Everyone was gone. I just thought. You didn't think, Wellington cut him off viciously. That's the point. You are not paid to think. You are paid to clean. The silence that followed was deafening. Marcus stood tall, absorbing the impact of the words with a dignity that made the professor's cruelty all the more stark. I'll report this to your supervisor, Wellington continued. Tampering with intellectual property is grounds for termination. I'll finish my rounds elsewhere, Marcus said quietly, turning to leave. And Johnson? Wellington called after him. Next time you feel compelled to play mathematician, remember your place. As Marcus pushed his cart down the hallway, the graduate students avoided eye contact, uncomfortable witnesses to an injustice they lacked the courage to address. None of them noticed the young man watching from the end of the corridor, Elijah Johnson, who had come to drop off his father's forgotten lunch. His eyes burned with a quiet fury as he turned and walked away, his back pain momentarily forgotten in the wake of his father's humiliation. Elijah Johnson stood by the bus stop near Stanford's campus, his father's lunch still clutched in his hand. The echo of Wellington's cruel words rang in his ears, mixing with painful memories of his own past humiliations. 3 years ago, Elijah had been the star student at Westridge High School despite only being 14. His mathematical abilities had placed him in advanced classes with students years older, but one teacher, Ms. Harrington, had seen his confidence as arrogance, his brilliance as a challenge to her authority. You can't correct me in front of the class, she had told him after he'd pointed out an error in her derivative calculations. It's disrespectful. But the solution was wrong, Elijah had said, confused. Isn't that more important? That afternoon, she'd kept him in detention, forcing him to sit perfectly still for hours at a hard wooden desk. When pain had shot through his back and he tried to stand, she'd physically pushed him back down. You'll stay seated until you learn respect. By the time he was allowed to leave, the damage was done. The herniated disc had required surgery, leaving him with chronic pain that made sitting for extended periods unbearable. His education had become a nightmare of physical agony. Now, watching his father disappear back into the building where he'd just been humiliated, Elijah felt a familiar rage build inside him. Always the same story, brilliant minds dismissed because of their skin color or social standing. The city bus arrived, and Elijah boarded with a heavy heart. His phone buzzed with a text from his online physics teacher, reminding him about an upcoming test. He'd been excelling in his distance learning program, the only educational option that accommodated his need to stand or lie down during classes. At home, Elijah paced their small apartment, unable to settle. His back throbbed, but the pain in his heart was worse. His father, one of the most intelligent people he knew, reduced to just a janitor, in the eyes of men like Wellington. He opened his laptop and pulled up Stanford's faculty page, searching for Richard Wellington. The professor's smug face stared back at him from the screen, acclaimed mathematician, department chair, recipient of prestigious awards. Scrolling further, Elijah found an announcement about an upcoming lecture where Wellington would present his latest research, including progress on the computational complexity problem. That equation. His father's elegant notation. A plan began forming in Elijah's mind. His father had always taught him to rise above prejudice, to let his work speak for itself. But sometimes, silence was complicity. Sometimes, a public reckoning was necessary. Elijah opened his notebook where he'd been working on the equation based on his father's photos. The solution was coming together in his mind, building on his father's insight, pushing beyond conventional approaches. If Wellington planned to present this research as solely his own, while threatening his father's livelihood for daring to contribute, well, perhaps Professor Wellington needed a lesson in humility. When Marcus returned home that evening, his shoulders were slumped in defeat. "They're reassigning me," he said quietly. "Different building. Different shift." Elijah looked up from his mathematics books. "Because of the equation?" Marcus nodded. Wellington complained to management. "That's not right, Dad." "It's not about right, son. It's about power." Marcus sank into his chair, suddenly looking older than his years. "I crossed a line." "By being smarter than they expected?" Elijah's voice rose. "By daring to think you could contribute?" "By forgetting my place in their world," Marcus replied softly. Elijah stood up, wincing as pain shot through his lower back. "Wellington's giving a lecture next week. On that exact problem." Marcus looked up sharply. "Elijah, don't even think about it. He's going to use your insight without credit. After humiliating you. Let it go, son. Some battles can't be won." But Elijah had inherited more than his father's mathematical genius, he'd inherited his quiet determination. Where Marcus had channeled that determination into survival, Elijah would channel his into justice. For his father. For himself. For every brilliant mind dismissed because it came packaged in the wrong body or the wrong uniform. The Wellington reckoning was coming. The morning of Wellington's lecture dawned bright and clear. Elijah woke early, his back already protesting the day ahead. He went through his stretching routine carefully, knowing he would need every bit of physical endurance to stand through the 2-hour presentation. Marcus had already left for his early shift, but he'd left a note on the kitchen counter. "Remember, it's about the mathematics. I'm proud of you no matter what happens." Elijah touched the note briefly, drawing strength from his father's words. Then he gathered his materials, notebook, calculations, and the doctor's note explaining his need to stand rather than sit during lectures. As he caught the bus to Stanford, anxiety and determination battled within him. What he was about to do could have consequences beyond today. Wellington was influential, he could make sure Elijah's academic future was compromised before it even began. But the alternative, staying silent while his father's contribution was erased and his dignity trampled, seemed worse than any potential backlash. His mind drifted back to that pivotal day 3 years ago. He'd been a freshman in high school, already taking senior-level math classes. Ms. Harrington had been explaining calculus concepts to the class, confidently writing equations on the whiteboard. "Ms. Harrington," Elijah had said, raising his hand. "I think there's an error in that last step." The classroom had fallen silent. Ms. Harrington's back had stiffened. "Excuse me." "The derivative," he'd explained, pointing to the board. "You applied the chain rule incorrectly." Several students had snickered, not at him, but at the teacher's mistake. That had been the true offense. "See me after class, Mr. Johnson," she'd said coldly. What followed was a 4-hour detention where she'd insisted he remain seated in a hard wooden chair. Every time pain had forced him to shift or stand, she ordered him back down, eventually physically pushing on his shoulders to enforce compliance. "You need to learn respect," she'd repeated. "Brilliant or not, you don't challenge a teacher in front of the class." By the time his father picked him up, the damage was done. The MRI later revealed a herniated disc. The surgery had helped, but the nerve damage left him with chronic pain, a permanent reminder of the price of challenging authority. The bus stopped at Stanford's main entrance, jolting Elijah from his memories. He adjusted his backpack and began the walk toward the mathematics building, rehearsing his approach in his mind. His phone buzzed with a text from his father, building filled with lecture attendees. Wellington looking smug as ever. "Be careful." Elijah smiled grimly. His father would be invisible to these academic elites, just another maintenance worker in gray, but Marcus saw everything. As he approached the building, doubt suddenly gripped him. Was he overreacting? Would confronting Wellington really change anything? Perhaps his father was right, perhaps some battles couldn't be won. Elijah paused on the path, considering retreat. Then he overheard a conversation between two passing professors. Wellington's apparently made a breakthrough on that computational problem. About time. He's been obsessed with it for years. Claims it's going to revolutionize the field. The casual certainty that Wellington deserved full credit, that no one else could have contributed, reignited Elijah's resolve. He straightened his shoulders, ignoring the twinge in his back, and continued toward the lecture hall. Inside, the auditorium was filling quickly. Elijah presented his registration to the graduate student at the door, who barely glanced at him before waving him through. He made his way to the back of the room where he could stand comfortably against the wall without blocking anyone's view. From this vantage point, he could see Wellington at the front of the hall, surrounded by admiring colleagues and students. The professor looked triumphant, basking in anticipatory acclaim. Elijah pulled out his phone and texted his father, "In position. About to begin." Marcus's reply came seconds later, "Remember who you are. You belong in that room as much as any of them." Elijah took a deep breath, steadying himself. Years of self-education, of studying late into the night while lying on his floor mat because sitting at a desk was too painful. Years of watching his father return home exhausted from cleaning the offices of men who would never recognize his brilliance. Today, invisibility would end. Today, someone would see them, truly see them, for the first time. As Wellington stepped up to the podium and the lights dimmed for his presentation, Elijah made his final decision. He would not shout or make a scene. He would not lead with accusation or anger. He would let the mathematics speak first. And if Wellington refused to listen, then, and only then, would he reveal the full truth of the equation's origins. With clarity of purpose, Elijah settled against the wall, ignoring the curious glances from those who wondered why he wouldn't take a seat. The pain in his back was nothing compared to the fire in his mind as Wellington began speaking, oblivious to the reckoning that awaited him. The lecture hall hummed with anticipation as Professor Richard Wellington adjusted the microphone. Nearly 200 people filled the seats, faculty members, graduate students, visiting mathematicians, and even a few undergraduate prodigies invited to witness what was being billed as a significant mathematical advancement. "Distinguished colleagues, esteemed students," Wellington began, his voice resonating with practiced authority. "For 2 years, I have been wrestling with what some of you have come to call Wellington's paradox, a computational complexity problem with implications for multiple fields." At the back of the hall, Elijah stood motionless, his notebook open, pen poised. He scanned the room, noticing a few people in the audience glancing curiously at him, the only person standing, before returning their attention to Wellington. "The challenge," Wellington continued, advancing to his first slide of equations, "has been finding an approach that bridges the apparent contradiction between these two computational states." For the next 40 minutes, Wellington guided his audience through the evolution of the problem, skillfully building dramatic tension around his struggle to solve it. He detailed false starts and misleading pathways, positioning himself as the lone intellectual hero battling mathematical uncertainty. Elijah's grip on his pen tightened. Not once did Wellington mention the breakthrough notation, his father's contribution that had redirected the entire approach. Instead, Wellington presented the new direction as his own sudden insight. And then, Wellington said, pausing for effect, I recognized that we needed to step outside conventional frameworks. The solution required breaking from established methodologies. In the back of the room, Elijah almost laughed aloud at the audacity. Breaking from established methodologies was exactly what his father had suggested in his small corner notation, the very insight Wellington was now claiming as his own. The professor continued, writing complex equations across the whiteboard, explaining each step with the confidence of a man who believed he owned every insight he presented. The audience watched, impressed by both the mathematics and Wellington's apparent brilliance. About an hour into the lecture, Wellington approached what Elijah recognized as the critical juncture, the point where the solution pathway either resolved elegantly or collapsed into contradiction. This, Wellington announced, circling a section of the equation, is where conventional approaches falter. But through persistent exploration, I discovered a novel approach. He wrote out the very reformulation Marcus had annotated on his board a week earlier. Elijah's heart pounded. The intellectual theft was now complete and public. His father's mathematical insight, born from years of self-education and quiet observation, had been appropriated without a moment's hesitation or attribution. Wellington spent the next 20 minutes elaborating on his breakthrough, drawing admiring nods from the audience. But as he approached the equation's resolution, he began to hesitate, his confidence faltering slightly. The implications, he said, tapping the board with his marker, extend into several domains of computational theory. However, there remain certain complexities in the final resolution. Elijah recognized the hesitation immediately. Wellington had followed his father's insight but hadn't fully grasped its implications. The professor was reaching the limits of his understanding, the point where the solution required the final leap of mathematical intuition that Elijah had spent the past week perfecting. Questions from the audience will be welcome following the presentation, Wellington said, moving to his concluding slides. Though I must warn you, the mathematics here is exceptionally advanced. Don't hesitate to request clarification if needed. The condescension in his tone was subtle but unmistakable, an implied assertion that few in the room could truly comprehend the depths of his work. Several graduate students shifted uncomfortably, while senior faculty members exchanged knowing glances. As Wellington wrapped up his presentation, Elijah mentally prepared for what would come next. The question and answer session would be his moment, his opportunity to challenge not just Wellington's claims to the work, but his understanding of the mathematics itself. And now, Wellington said, clicking to his final slide, I'll take questions from the audience. Hands rose throughout the lecture hall. Wellington pointed to a gray-haired professor in the front row. Fascinating work, Richard. Have you considered the implications for quantum computing algorithms? Wellington launched into a confident response, though Elijah noted he carefully avoided specifics. 3 more questions followed, all from senior faculty, all met with Wellington's practiced academic poise. Then Wellington gestured toward the back of the room. The young man standing against the wall. You've been taking notes quite intensely. Do you have a question? All eyes turned to Elijah. The moment had arrived. Yes, Professor Wellington, Elijah said, his voice clear and steady. I'm curious about your resolution of the central paradox. The approach you've outlined leaves an unresolved discontinuity in the third transformational step. A murmur rippled through the audience. Wellington's expression flickered between surprise and annoyance. I believe you've misunderstood the mathematics, young man, he replied dismissively. There is no discontinuity. With respect, Professor, Elijah countered, if you follow your own logic through to its conclusion, the discontinuity becomes evident. He paused, then added, perhaps this is why you haven't yet presented a complete solution. The audience fell silent. Wellington's face hardened, his academic authority directly challenged in front of his peers. And you believe you understand this problem better than I do? Wellington's voice was dangerously quiet. Elijah met his gaze steadily. I believe the mathematics speaks for itself, Professor. May I approach the board? A tense silence filled the lecture hall. Wellington stared at Elijah, clearly weighing his options. To refuse would appear defensive, yet allowing this unknown young man to approach the board risked unpredictable consequences. By all means, Wellington finally said, his tone falsely generous. Though I must warn everyone, this may be a waste of our valuable time. Scattered nervous laughter rippled through the audience as Elijah made his way down the side aisle toward the front. Every step sent small jolts of pain through his back, but adrenaline dulled the sensation. He could feel eyes following him, curious, dismissive, a few even sympathetic. As he reached the front of the hall, Wellington extended a marker with a condescending smile. "Do enlighten us, Mr. Johnson," Elijah replied, accepting the marker. Elijah Johnson. If Wellington recognized the surname, he gave no indication. He stepped aside with exaggerated courtesy, clearly expecting, perhaps hoping, that Elijah would embarrass himself. Standing before the whiteboard, Elijah took a deep breath. Years of self-education, of studying mathematics while lying on his floor mat, had prepared him for this moment. He turned to face the audience. "Professor Wellington has presented an innovative approach to this computational problem," Elijah began diplomatically. "However, there's a critical discontinuity that emerges when we follow the logic to its conclusion." He turned to the board and began writing, his handwriting neat and precise, much like his father's. The audience watched in growing surprise as complex mathematical notations flowed from his marker with confident ease. "If we examine this section," Elijah continued, circling part of Wellington's equation, "we can see that the apparent resolution creates a new contradiction here." He added several lines of mathematical reasoning, then stepped back. Wellington's face had paled slightly as he recognized the validity of Elijah's observation. This was no amateur critique but a sophisticated analysis that exposed a genuine flaw in his presentation. Furthermore, Elijah continued, "The approach introduced here," he indicated the section based on Marcus's annotation, "while brilliantly redirecting the solution pathway, requires additional transformations to resolve completely." He began filling in the missing steps, building on his father's insight with his own mathematical extensions. The lecture hall remained eerily silent except for the squeak of the marker against the whiteboard. Several faculty members leaned forward in their seats, expressions shifting from skepticism to surprise and then to genuine interest. One elderly professor in the front row was nodding slowly, eyebrows raised in appreciation of what he was witnessing. Wellington cleared his throat. "Young man, while your enthusiasm is commendable, perhaps we should." "I'm nearly finished, Professor," Elijah replied without turning from the board. "Just establishing the final resolution." He completed a complex sequence of mathematical steps, then turned back to face the audience. With this approach, the paradox dissolves entirely. The computational states reconcile without contradiction. The silence that followed was profound. Several mathematicians were hurriedly scribbling notes, their expressions intent. Others were whispering to colleagues, pointing at specific elements of Elijah's solution. Wellington stared at the board, his academic pride visibly warring with his mathematical integrity. The solution was elegant, comprehensive, and clearly beyond what he had been able to develop himself. "This is..." Wellington began, then paused, recalibrating. "This is certainly an interesting theoretical approach, though I'm not convinced it's correct," interrupted an elderly man in the front row, Professor Emeritus William Chen, one of the department's most respected figures. "The young man has resolved the discontinuity. Quite brilliantly, I might add." Murmurs of agreement spread through the audience. Wellington's expression hardened. "Perhaps," he conceded tightly. "Though I question where you acquired this mathematical insight, Mr. Johnson. Are you a student here? Under which professor?" The implied accusation hung in the air, that Elijah had somehow stolen these ideas rather than developed them himself. "I'm not currently enrolled at Stanford," Elijah replied calmly. "I completed my high school education through distance learning due to medical constraints." Disbelieving whispers circulated. A high school graduate resolving a problem that had stumped established mathematicians? Wellington seized on the skepticism. So you expect us to believe that you, with no formal university education, independently developed this solution to an advanced computational problem? Wellington's tone was openly scornful now. Perhaps you'd like to explain exactly how you gained access to this level of mathematics. Elijah took a deep breath. The moment of truth had arrived. I've been studying advanced mathematics since I was 12, he said. But this particular problem, he gestured to the board, came to my attention through my father. Wellington's eyes narrowed. Your father? And who might he be? A mathematician I know, perhaps. You've met him, Elijah replied, his voice steady despite the hammering of his heart. He cleans your office. The lecture hall erupted in startled exclamations and confused questions. Wellington's face flushed deep red, then paled dramatically as realization dawned. Johnson. He repeated, connecting the surname. The janitor? My father is Marcus Johnson, Elijah confirmed, his voice carrying through the now silent auditorium. He's worked as a custodian here for 15 years. And during that time, he's educated himself in mathematics by studying the work left on boards across this department. Wellington's face contorted with disbelief. This is absurd. You expect us to believe. The notation on your board last week, Elijah interrupted, the one that redirected your entire approach to this problem, that was my father's work. The revelation sent another shock wave through the audience. Professor Chen leaned forward in his seat, eyes widening in recognition. The janitor who cleans our offices. That's your father? Yes, Elijah replied. The man you look past every day. The man Professor Wellington threatened to have fired for daring to make a mathematical contribution. All eyes turned to Wellington, whose expression had shifted from shock to anger. This is preposterous. A maintenance worker cannot possibly understand this level of mathematics, let alone contribute to it. Why not? Challenged Professor Chen, his voice unexpectedly sharp. Because he doesn't have formal credentials. Because he cleans floors instead of writing papers. Wellington sputtered, caught off guard by the challenge from a colleague. Because advanced mathematics requires years of specialized training, rigorous study, all of which my father pursued on his own, Elijah interjected. Night after night, year after year. Learning from the very mathematicians who never saw him as anything more than the man who emptied their trash. From the back of the hall came a soft disturbance. Heads turned as Marcus Johnson himself appeared in the doorway, still in his gray custodial uniform. He'd been cleaning nearby when word of what was happening reached him. The room fell silent as Marcus slowly walked down the center aisle. His posture was straight, his dignity palpable despite his work clothes. Every eye followed him as he approached the front of the hall. When he reached the whiteboard, he stood beside his son, facing the audience that had never truly seen him before. Mr. Johnson, Professor Chen said, rising from his seat. Did you write the notation on Professor Wellington's board last week? Marcus nodded. I did. I've been following the problem for months. The approach seemed constrained. I saw a different pathway. This is ridiculous, Wellington interjected, though with noticeably less conviction. Even if he did scribble something, the full development of the approach was entirely my work. Was it? Elijah asked quietly. He turned to the board and pointed to a specific section. Then perhaps you could explain this transitional step to us, Professor. The one that bridges the apparent contradiction. Wellington stared at the board, then back at Elijah. The trap was elegant, the very section Elijah had highlighted was one Wellington himself hadn't fully understood, despite presenting it as his own work. The complexities of advanced mathematics can't always be articulated simply, Wellington hedged, avoiding the direct challenge. Actually, they can, Marcus said, speaking up. His voice was soft but carried a quiet authority born from years of genuine understanding rather than academic posturing. The beauty of mathematics is its clarity. Without waiting for permission, Marcus took the marker from his son and approached the board. With confident strokes, he elaborated on the critical transition, explaining each step with a natural eloquence that belied his lack of formal training. The audience watched in stunned silence as the custodian they'd ignored for years demonstrated a mathematical fluency that rivaled their department chairs. The pathway becomes evident, Marcus explained, completing his annotation, when you release the constraint of conventional frameworks and allow the mathematics to reveal its own internal logic. Professor Emeritus Chen was nodding, a smile spreading across his face. Several other faculty members exchanged impressed glances. The graduate students looked shell-shocked. Sophia, Wellington's doctoral candidate, suddenly stood up. "That's exactly what I've been trying to say for months," she exclaimed. The conventional approach was creating artificial barriers. Wellington's face had drained of color. His academic authority, his mathematical credibility, his very identity as the dominant intellect in the room, all were crumbling before his eyes. "This is irregular," he managed, falling back on procedural objections when mathematical ones failed him. "Maintenance staff aren't authorized to use academic materials or participate in research." "Is that really your concern right now, Richard?" Professor Chen asked incredulously. "That a brilliant mathematical mind has been cleaning our offices instead of collaborating with us? That we've been walking past him for years without seeing him?" The audience's mood was shifting palpably. What had begun as skepticism toward Elijah and Marcus was transforming into uncomfortable self-reflection. How many other invisible people had they failed to see, to acknowledge, to respect? Elijah stepped forward again, wincing slightly as his back protested. "The issue isn't just about one equation or one moment of disrespect," he said. "It's about who gets to participate in the pursuit of knowledge. Who gets recognized for their contributions." He turned to Wellington. "When you found my father's notation, you didn't ask who wrote it or why. You assumed it couldn't possibly come from someone like him. And when you discovered it did, your response wasn't interest or appreciation, it was punishment." Wellington opened his mouth to respond, then closed it again. For perhaps the first time in his career, the prestigious professor found himself without words. In the profound silence that followed, Marcus placed his hand on his son's shoulder, a gesture of both support and restraint. This wasn't about humiliating Wellington, it was about being seen. "I never expected credit," Marcus said quietly. "I just loved the mathematics. But my son," his voice swelled with quiet pride, "my son deserves to be seen for the brilliant mind he is. Not dismissed because of who his father is or because he can't sit through your lectures." "Can't sit?" Professor Chen asked, confused. Elijah straightened, meeting the professor's gaze directly. "I have a back injury from a previous educational setting where a teacher physically forced me to remain seated during detention. It makes traditional classroom arrangements impossible for me." Another layer of understanding rippled through the audience. Not just racial prejudice and class barriers, but ableism too had shaped this young man's path. Yet despite these challenges, Marcus continued, he's mastered mathematics that apparently stumped this entire department. A hint of paternal pride crept into his voice. "Perhaps it's time to reconsider who belongs in these halls, and how they're welcomed when they arrive." The elder Professor Chen approached the whiteboard, examining the solution closely. "This is remarkable work," he said, turning to face both Johnsons. "Truly innovative." He extended his hand to Marcus. "I would very much like to hear more about your mathematical journey, Mr. Johnson." As they shook hands, the respected professor and the overlooked janitor, something fundamental shifted in the lecture hall. Boundaries of title and status momentarily dissolved, replaced by the pure recognition of intellectual kinship. Wellington stood to the side, witnessing his carefully constructed world of academic hierarchy crumble before him. The mathematics, the pure, democratic language of logic that cared nothing for social status, had rendered its own verdict. And for once in his distinguished career, Professor Richard Wellington found himself truly speechless. In the days following what quickly became known across campus as the Wellington Lecture Incident, a profound reckoning swept through Stanford's mathematics department. What had begun as a single confrontation had catalyzed conversations about implicit bias, academic gatekeeping, and whose knowledge was valued, and why. For Wellington himself, the aftermath was particularly brutal. His initial instinct had been defensive anger, filing formal complaints about Marcus's inappropriate use of university resources and Elijah's disruptive behavior during an academic presentation. But when three esteemed colleagues, including Professor Chen, countered with their own letter praising the mathematical insights of both Johnson's and questioning Wellington's ethical conduct in claiming credit for Marcus's work, the narrative quickly shifted. For days after the lecture, Wellington sat in Dean Garcia's office, uncharacteristically subdued. "Richard," the dean said gently, "this situation has revealed some uncomfortable truths about our institutional culture." Wellington stared out the window. "You want me to apologize?" "I want you to reflect," the dean corrected, "on what it means to truly value knowledge, regardless of its source." "He was writing on my board," Wellington muttered, though the argument sounded petty even to his own ears. "He was contributing to mathematical understanding," Dean Garcia countered. "And instead of recognizing that contribution, you threatened his livelihood." The harsh truth hung between them. "The Johnsons aren't pressing any formal charges of academic dishonesty," the dean continued. "Though they would be within their rights to do so, given that you presented Marcus's insights as your own." Wellington flinched. In the academic world, few accusations were more serious. "What do they want, then?" he asked quietly. "Recognition," the dean replied simply. "Not just for themselves, but for others like them, brilliant minds excluded from academic spaces by circumstance, prejudice, or disability." Meanwhile, across campus, Marcus and Elijah found themselves in an unfamiliar position, visible, acknowledged, respected. Professor Chen had arranged a special departmental symposium where Elijah presented his complete solution to the computational problem, standing comfortably at the whiteboard while faculty and graduate students listened with genuine interest. Afterward, Marcus found himself surrounded by mathematicians eager to understand how he had educated himself over the years. "Primarily through observation," he explained. "I'd study the boards after hours, photograph interesting problems, research them at home." "For 15 years, one professor asked, astonished. "Without any formal guidance?" "Mathematics speaks its own language," Marcus replied with a slight smile. "If you listen carefully enough, it guides you." Sophia, Wellington's graduate student, approached Elijah after his presentation. "Your solution is brilliant," she said. "And I'm sorry I didn't speak up when Wellington dismissed your father." Elijah nodded, understanding the complex power dynamics that had silenced her. "We all make choices based on the systems we're operating within. Still," she insisted, "there was a right thing to do, and I missed it." Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Dean Garcia, accompanied by a woman Elijah didn't recognize. "Mr. Johnson," the dean said, addressing Elijah. "This is Dr. Amara Williams, head of our accessibility services and special academic arrangements." The woman extended her hand with a warm smile. "I've heard quite a bit about you, Elijah. We'd like to discuss some possibilities for your academic future here at Stanford." Elijah's eyes widened. "At Stanford?" "We have programs for exceptional students with non-traditional backgrounds," Dr. Williams explained. "And we're fully equipped to accommodate your physical needs, standing desks, alternative assessment arrangements, flexible attendance policies." As they discussed possibilities, Marcus watched from across the room, his chest tight with emotion. This was everything he'd ever wanted for his son: recognition, opportunity, accommodation. The path that had been closed to him was opening for Elijah. The following day brought another unexpected development. Marcus was summoned to the department chair's office, where he found not only Professor Chen but several other faculty members waiting. "Mr. Johnson," Chen began, "we've been discussing your mathematical contributions and self-education with great interest." Marcus shifted uncomfortably, unaccustomed to being the center of academic attention. "We'd like to offer you a position," Chen continued. "Not as custodial staff, but as a departmental research assistant with flexible hours that would allow you to formally study mathematics while contributing to our research projects." Marcus stared at him in disbelief. "A research position? But I don't have credentials." "You have something more valuable," another professor interjected. "You have insight, creativity, and a perspective untainted by academic orthodoxy. She smiled. And from what we've seen, you have mathematical intuition that can't be taught, only nurtured. As Marcus struggled to absorb this life-changing offer, the door opened once more. Professor Wellington entered, looking uncomfortable but determined. The room fell silent as Wellington approached Marcus. For a moment, the power dynamic that had defined their relationship for 15 years hung between them, then Wellington extended his hand. "Mr. Johnson," he said formally, "I owe you an apology. Your mathematical insight was extraordinary. And my response was inexcusable." Marcus hesitated, then accepted the handshake. Not for Wellington's sake, but for his own, to close this chapter with dignity rather than bitterness. "Mathematics doesn't care about titles, Professor," Marcus said quietly. "Only truth." Wellington nodded, humbled by the simple wisdom. "I'm learning that," he admitted. "Rather later than I should have." As Wellington turned to leave, he paused. "Your son's solution was elegant. He sees patterns where others see only complexity." A ghost of a smile touched his lips. "He didn't get that from my lectures." "No," Marcus agreed. "He got it from watching his father clean floors while studying equations others had abandoned for the night." It was a simple truth, but it struck at the heart of every assumption in the room about where knowledge lived and who had the right to claim it. 6 months later, the mathematics department of Stanford University hosted a special symposium on non-traditional pathways in mathematical education. The lecture hall was filled to capacity as academics from across the country gathered to hear presentations on innovative approaches to mathematical learning. At the podium stood Marcus Johnson, no longer in a custodial uniform, but dressed in a simple button-down shirt and slacks. Behind him, the screen displayed the title of his presentation, Invisible Learners, Self-Education in the Margins. "For 15 years, Marcus began, I cleaned the offices of some of the world's most brilliant mathematicians. I emptied their trash cans, wiped their whiteboards, and vacuumed their floors. But I also studied their equations, absorbed their lectures through closed doors, and educated myself in the silent hours after everyone had gone home." In the audience, Professor Wellington sat quietly, a different man than he had been 6 months before. The Wellington incident, as it had come to be known, had forced him to confront uncomfortable truths about his assumptions and privileges. The process hadn't been easy, but it had been necessary. "Mathematics doesn't recognize credentials," Marcus continued. "It doesn't care about degrees or titles or official positions. It responds only to understanding, to insight, to the willingness to see patterns where others see chaos." In the front row, Elijah Johnson watched his father with quiet pride. Now a special admissions student at Stanford, he attended classes standing at the back of lecture halls or lying on a specially designed ergonomic mat during seminars. His back condition remained, but it no longer defined him or limited his educational opportunities. "What my son and I experienced isn't unique," Marcus said. "Across this country, across the world, brilliant minds are excluded from academic spaces because they don't fit our narrow definitions of what a scholar looks like, how a student should learn, or who has the right to contribute to our collective knowledge." In the months since the confrontation, Marcus had become an unexpected symbol of educational gatekeeping and the need for institutional change. His story had spread beyond Stanford, prompting discussions at universities nationwide about hidden biases and missed opportunities. The equation that sparked this journey wasn't special because it was difficult, Marcus explained, displaying the now famous computational problem on the screen. It was special because it revealed the discontinuity not just in mathematics, but in our perception of who belongs in these spaces. As he concluded his presentation, the applause was genuine and sustained. Among the most enthusiastic was Professor Wellington, who had undergone his own transformation, from antagonist to advocate for institutional change. Later, at a small reception, Wellington approached Marcus and Elijah. "Your presentation was powerful," he said to Marcus. "It's changed how I teach, how I mentor my students." "That's all we ever wanted," Marcus replied. "Not personal recognition, but systemic change." Elijah nodded. "Mathematics should be accessible to everyone willing to do the work, regardless of their background or physical conditions. We're implementing those changes, Wellington acknowledged. Slowly, perhaps, but genuinely. Indeed, Stanford's mathematics department had begun recording all lectures for asynchronous learning, offering flexible assessment options, and even developing a community outreach program where faculty and graduate students taught advanced mathematics in underserved neighborhoods. As the three men talked, Dean Garcia approached with a visitor, a woman in her 50s with a stern expression that softened when she saw Elijah. "Ms. Harrington," Elijah said quietly, recognizing the teacher who had caused his injury years before. "Elijah," she replied, clearly uncomfortable. I've been following your story. Your success." An awkward silence fell between them. "I never apologized," she finally said. "For what happened that day. For not believing in you. For causing your injury." Elijah studied her face, seeing not the intimidating authority figure from his past but a flawed human grappling with her own mistakes. "I've spent my career teaching mathematics," Ms. Harrington continued, "but I failed to recognize genuine mathematical brilliance when it was sitting in my classroom." Her voice cracked slightly. "I've come to learn from you now, not just about equations, but about resilience." Elijah felt the weight of years of pain and anger, not just physical, but emotional. The teacher who had refused to see him, who had physically forced him to stay seated until his back gave out, now stood before him seeking forgiveness. "The past can't be undone," Elijah said finally. "But we can build something better from it." He gestured toward the symposium participants mingling around them. "That's what today is about." Ms. Harrington nodded, tears in her eyes. "I'm implementing changes in my own classroom now. Standing desks. Flexible learning positions. Listening, really listening, to my students." As she walked away, Wellington watched with newfound understanding. "Redemption is a difficult path," he observed quietly. "But a necessary one," Marcus replied. "For all of us." Later that evening, father and son stood together outside the mathematics building where their journey had begun, one as an invisible custodian, the other as a brilliant young man unable to sit in traditional classrooms. "Did you ever imagine this?" Elijah asked, gesturing toward the window of Wellington's office where the famous equation had first been written. Marcus smiled. "Not in detail. But I always knew you were destined for these halls." He placed his hand on his son's shoulder. "Not just to learn, but to transform." As they walked across the campus, Marcus to his new office where he now worked as a research assistant while pursuing his own degree, Elijah to his adaptive dormitory room, they passed a custodian emptying trash bins. Marcus nodded to him with respectful recognition, one invisible man acknowledging another. The custodian looked startled, then straightened with a small smile of dignity. In that simple exchange lay the true measure of their victory. Not just in Marcus and Elijah's personal achievements, but in the subtle shift of perception that now allowed them, and hopefully others, to truly see the humanity in each person they encountered, regardless of their position or appearance. The equation that had started it all, Wellington's paradox, had been solved. But the greater paradox, how brilliance could go unrecognized simply because of where it resided, was still being addressed, one changed mind at a time. And in the halls that Marcus had once silently cleaned, a new sign hung outside the mathematics department: "Mathematics belongs to everyone brave enough to pursue it." It wasn't perfect redemption. But it was a beginning. Stanford professor mocked a janitor for a complex equation, then, the janitor's son came and made the professor speechless. Dear friend, this story reminds us that brilliance exists everywhere, in the janitor cleaning our offices, the service worker we barely acknowledge, the student who can't sit still because of physical pain. Our biases and prejudices blind us to the potential surrounding us every day. When we judge others based on appearance, position, or physical ability, we don't just hurt them, we rob our world of their valuable contributions. True intelligence recognizes no boundaries of race, class, or physical condition. It thrives wherever there is curiosity, persistence, and courage. If this story moved you, please like this video and subscribe to support our mission of sharing powerful narratives that challenge stereotypes and celebrate overlooked heroes among us. Together, we can build a world where everyone's brilliance is seen.